Ian Schoultz, the poet. Grandfather Passes in the Hall is the title of the poem. And if Rachel, you want to read this one?
Sure. Okay. Grandfather passes in the hall. I invoke your death to take from you the certainty of your hands that press steel poles into the lake bed to lay out the dock in the spring. I carry you when I am stuffed with caramel corn. You better get in on this, kid. I pick up a fork from the table and hold it close to my eye regardless of your warning. I carry you like a dark heart in the world I crawl in. Fill a progenitive herds for shelter and warm disinterest. I evoke your death and ask to be memorable. You said I looked bored at your deathbed. I guess I was bored at your deathbed and squirmed in my little body away from eye contact. I want more from you now. I want to cross the bridge north to a wilderness, clear cut and picked over. Legions of copper miners, loggers, and fishermen feeding their winnings down the rivers over lakes. I want more from you now. Birch trees along a highway whose paper white bark makes good kindling through the tree, though the tree may die if the bark is removed directly from the trunk. I would only do that if it were life or death, Dad said when we went to the cabin to clean. I will never build a home or cure deer meats. I will cross a bridge far to the south. Small fires on steel towers burn off natural gas. The pavement bathes in fog. I invoke your death to be remembered by you. So I know, Chris, right? I know you didn't get to read this poem. And I always knew I was going to select this poem, I think. When I talked to Aaron earlier today, I was like, I'm pretty sure it's going to be Grandfather Passes in the Hall, but I'll take another quick dive. But, first of all, I have a deep love for long continuous stanzas as a poem. I think it takes a lot of skill to grab a reader and hold them through a page-long stanza that's uninterrupted, which is called a stickic. That's one of my favorite vocab words, the type of poem this is. And I really think the line breaks are excellent. So I think our listeners, if they have a chance, should really pull up this poem and take a look at the way it's laid out. Because I think, every word is in its right place in this poem. It's very good in that sense. So there's a couple of reasons I chose it. The first is the repetition of invoke. And there's a couple of different ways that you can look at the word invoke. First definition just being to call on as a witness, to invoke something is, I think I actually pulled up the Webster's or Oxford. Yeah, I used Oxford. I never used Webster's. But to cite or appeal to as an authority for an action or support of an argument, or to call on a deity or spirit in prayer as a witness or for inspiration. And I really looked at the second definition here, right? The idea of invoking a deity or a spirit and the way that we sometimes worship our elders and the way that they become these mystical figures, right? And the sense of memory in this poem. I pick up a fork from the table and hold it close to my eye, regardless of your warning. This is definitely from the perspective of your child. I looked bored at your deathbed. I guess I was bored at your deathbed, and I squirmed in my little body away from eye contact. And then the repetition of the sentence, I want more from you now. And you hear that twice. And another thing that I thought was a really interesting repetition was the bridges that are being mentioned here. I want to cross the bridge north to the wilderness, clear cut and picked over. But this writer knows that that's not what's going to happen. I will never build a home or cure deer meats. I will cross a bridge far to the south. Small fires on steel towers burn off natural gas. And when I looked up the background for this writer, the little bio, they're from Louisiana. So yes, looking to the south, you would see the oil fields, right? The oil fields and natural gas fields. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about this poem is that neither option, crossing north nor south, is necessarily better than the other one. It's necessarily good because it's clear cut and picked over, and there's a bunch of copper miners, loggers, and fishermen feeding their winnings down the river over lakes. There's a sort of inevitability to that, right? Like either you go north or go south, but you're in two types of industry. But and these like definitive statements. I will never build a home or cure deer meats. I want more from you now. I want to cross the bridge north. It's powerful. And there's I think it's direct, but I think there's a lot to be interpreted here. And there's almost this sense of mysticism from it. The way that we're talking about, I think the way that we're talking about like the birch trees and the paper white bark and the crossing north to the picked over wilderness. And then the last line, I invoke your death to be remembered by you, is I'll remember that line. It is memorable. Beautiful poem. I really appreciate Ian for writing this.
And I'll put a challenge out there to any writers. Use the word philoprogenerative in a poem and have it not like seem weird or like overwrought or like, because like even when I like reread this poem and I looked over it again, it's like, oh, yeah, that's a weird word. It didn't like stand out in some way, but it's such a like unusual word. So
Like
I
a
think
GRE vocab word.
I know it speaks to like how much else is going on in the poem where you're not, I was at least speaking for myself, I wasn't distracted by it. And like, why did he use that? It didn't seem out of place in the context. So yeah, that's just, I think that's kind of one of those signs when you're, you know, evaluating poems, and I guess Rachel and Anne and Chris also can speak to it. It's like, you notice things like, oh, the second time through that they did this little trick, they did that little thing. So I think in each of the poems we've talked about so far, there's these kind of really practical techniques. And this one, like Rachel, you mentioned the single stanza, you can kind of like hide little things in there where in when you break up stanzas in shorter chunks, you can't hide as much, or you know, something doesn't like pass through the reader's eye. And this was kind of an interesting take on how much is packed in here, and like you could read it how many times, 5 times, 10 times, and it's like, oh, I didn't even see that image, I didn't see that phrase. So yeah, there was just kind of so much coming through on multiple reads with this poem. I think that was one of the things that stood out to me.
Well, and speaking of that word, philoprogenitive, the words that surround it too, the line that precedes it, I carry you like a dark heart in the world I crawl in. Philoprogenitive herds for shelter and warm disinterest. Philoprogenitive means many offspring. So philoprogenitive herds is a really interesting way to describe the world that you crawl in. And it's, again, it's like every single line here is well placed. The next, after warm disinterest, we have I evoke your death and ask it to be memorable, but yet this writer was bored at grandfather's deathbed. So was it a memorable death? There's so much sadness just oozing out of this poem, but not in a way that takes the emotional tone so high that you can't read it without feeling like you're reading literature. And I think that's a really hard line to tread. I've struggled with it a lot in my own work, making sure that you rein in your emotional tone so that you can get your point across and so that you can still make it art. But yeah, really great. But yeah, philoprogenitive. Like I had to read it a couple of times and then I read it out loud before I joined this podcast because I was like, am I going to stumble over that? But it works, and it works rhythmically in the poem.
I found that line, I carry you like a dark heart in the world I crawl in, that you mentioned, Rachel. So much of it are these memories that are specific to paint the character, to paint the grandfather, to get this lineage going, to paint the dad. You've got these generational effects, right? I'm really aware of the subtlety that he mentions of the hazardous or damning effects on the environment that have passed in the grandfather's time, and the dad's trying to sort of lessen that by his teaching to his son, and then you've got the son going off, or the grandson going off. But that line, I carry like a dark heart in the world I crawl in, I think that was the crux of the sadness for me. He had these different great specifics, but that I kept coming back to that as I read through. And then I love that I want more from you now. It's as if that maturity, that awareness of loss is coming now to him at this age of, you know, his dad's still alive, so he's somewhere in his adulthood, it sounds like, and ready to leave and to go on. I did love the last line so much, like you said, so memorable. I invoke your death to be remembered by you. And the whole poem, he's remembering his grandfather, but really his pleading is he wants to be remembered. He wants to have this connection to that past.
That's
Well, you
that's a lot,
started
Ed.
talking about the archival aspect that reminded me of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my impulse towards the archival is like a superficial way to do what this poem is succeeding at. I'm very interested, though a little desperate, but I'm interested in things like when people talk about the strength of my ancestors, or Valhalla, when you die, you're going to the halls of your ancestors, Native American, kind of connecting with your ancestors and being able to pull from the strength. And I have a strange, or what to me feels like a strange situation, where my father was born in 1939 and his father was born in 95. And I deliberately like to flash that number because people usually have to do a little second take work to see if you. So I was born, yeah, okay. So my grandfather was born in 1895, which means his father was very aware of the Civil War. So in some way, I feel kind of connected to history because we've waited a long time in my family to have kids. And so you've got this nice long string back, but I know nothing about any of that lineage. It's just kind of a fun little exercise to think about it. And all I have is my dad's obsession with his own childhood, but no other connections, no other tree branches, which reminds me of one of the other poems that we didn't get to talk about. And so there's this strange desire to honor his memory, but also sort of maintain my sense of self in whatever the lineage is. And so when you get to a line like, I invoke your death to be remembered by you, that one just like stabs me in the neck with a knitting needle, because I've been thinking about that my entire life, because my dad's obsessed with mortality and also life, but also death. And the way that plays out through poetry is we get interested in the poets who are ululating about life, death, mortality. So we like Dylan Thomas and his ilk. And so seeing somebody kind of strip it down to its very essentials like this, very appealing and tough to get through, but I like it the first time through.
Well, and also the sense of crossing bridges here, right? There's either you're going to cross a bridge to the north and you're going to become a copper miner, a logger, or a fisherman, and you're going to piss away your winnings, and it's going to stream down the rivers over the lakes. Or you're going to cross to the south and you're going to ostensibly work near the natural gas towers and the pavement that bathes in fog. But also death is a crossing, right? Death is another bridge that you cross. So there's like this sense of inevitability in this poem. That's a sad type of inevitability. There's something really blue collar about it. The grandfather who stabbed poles into the lake bed and set up the docks. And all of these people that are all of these options are to work with your hands, but this child will never build a home or cure deer meats, right? They're not gonna live on their little island and stay and build a home and stay on, say, whatever your homestead is. They're going to go off and work for industry, inevitably so. And sorry, I lost my train of thought again, but I think a lot about the bridges and the sense of like crossing and the sense of inevitability in this, and the sort of blue collar workers that are mentioned in this. I really identify with that, coming from a town where a lot of people are blue collar and coming from a sort of blue collar family myself. So yeah, just, I can only praise. I have nothing but praise.